The New England Patriots are getting dangerously close to one of the most important moments of the preseason, and the next few days could completely change the shape of this roster. With roster cut-down day approaching on Sunday at 6:20 p.m., the Patriots have to go from 90 players down to just 53. And because the team still has one preseason game against the Cleveland Browns on Thursday, several decisions could be made very quickly. Cuts are expected to begin before Sunday, with moves potentially coming on Friday and Saturday before the final deadline arrives. And that is exactly why some players who looked like potential roster locks earlier in the summer are suddenly facing a very different situation. This is not simply about who has talent. At this point, the Patriots have to look at production, versatility, special teams value, positional depth, and what each player can realistically give the team during the regular season. When you put all of those factors together, there are several names that stand out as legitimate surprise cut candidates. One of the biggest questions is at running back, where the battle for the third spot has become much more complicated than it appeared a few weeks ago. Miller had a moment during the preseason when he appeared to be moving forward, but his performance against Philadelphia created more questions than answers. He received 2 more carries than the competing back, but produced only 3 additional rushing yards. The bigger issue was what happened as a receiver. Miller finished with just 1 catch, while Lynn Bowden produced 3 receptions for 41 yards and also scored a touchdown. That versatility matters enormously when a team is deciding which running back can provide value in more than one phase of the offense. The situation becomes even more interesting when special teams enters the conversation. The Patriots do not simply need another player who can carry the football. They need someone who can justify taking one of those precious 53 roster spots. During the preseason games against Indianapolis and Philadelphia, the competing option was used on the kickoff team and across special teams. That gives him a major advantage because Miller has not shown the same special teams value. If the Patriots decide that the third running back needs to contribute there, Miller could find himself on the outside looking in, with the practice squad becoming a much more realistic destination. Then there is the linebacker position, and this may be one of the most surprising developments of all. Chad Muma entered the summer with expectations that he could establish himself as a legitimate part of the Patriots defense. Instead, his preseason performances have created serious concerns. The biggest problem is that the mistakes are not isolated. Against Philadelphia, he was involved in a blown coverage that resulted in a 25-yard gain, and he also missed 2 tackles during the game. Those problems become even more concerning because the Eagles did not play their starters in that preseason matchup. For a team that already does not have tremendous linebacker depth, that puts the Patriots in a difficult position. The current competition includes several players fighting for limited spots, meaning Muma cannot afford to simply rely on the reputation he built during training camp. The coaching staff has to decide whether his potential is enough to justify keeping him, or whether the Patriots would be better served finding another option outside the organization. The possibility of bringing in a veteran linebacker is even mentioned as an alternative, because the concern is not simply about depth, it is about whether the player can actually be trusted when the regular season arrives. At the same time, there has been a much more encouraging development involving Obi Melifonwu. His 4th down play against Philadelphia, when he disrupted a pass near the goal line, showed the kind of impact that can change a roster battle. That type of play matters because young players on rookie contracts have an opportunity to earn their place by showing the coaching staff that they can contribute immediately. The Patriots may ultimately decide that going younger at the position makes more sense, especially if the competition continues to separate in the final preseason game. Another major question is along the offensive line, where James Hudson Jr. has struggled to make a convincing case for a roster spot. He has played both tackle and guard for New England, partly because injuries have forced the team to move players around. But versatility only matters if the player can execute consistently, and the mistakes have continued to pile up. Against Philadelphia, he was flagged for a holding penalty on the opening drive, committed another hold on that same drive, and then allowed an untouched sack on the following possession. Those are the kinds of mistakes that can quickly destroy a player's chances when the roster is already crowded. The Patriots also have another reason to consider moving on from Hudson. The team has added veteran depth at the position, which makes it harder to justify keeping a player who has struggled to avoid penalties and protection breakdowns. The situation is especially important because the Patriots cannot afford to carry players simply because they can fill multiple offensive line positions. Every roster spot has value, and the question becomes whether Hudson is giving the team enough in return for that spot. Based on the preseason evidence described in the file, he is one of the players who could be in serious danger when the cuts begin. Then we get to the cornerback room, where one of the most difficult decisions could involve Markellus Dial. This is particularly significant because he is one of only 2 players remaining on the Patriots roster from the 2024 draft class, alongside Drake May. But being part of a previous draft class does not guarantee a roster spot, especially when the competition at the position is so intense. The Patriots already have 3 established starters, and behind them, there is a group of players fighting for a limited number of backup positions. One of the biggest developments in that competition has been Kendall Vildor's rise. His preseason performance against Philadelphia gave the coaching staff something concrete to reward. He had an interception called back, followed that with 2 pass breakups, and received praise from Mike Vrabel afterward. Even more telling was what happened after his strong sequence. The Patriots took him off the field rather than continuing to expose him to unnecessary risk, which can be viewed as a sign that the coaching staff had already seen enough to feel comfortable with what he had shown. That creates a difficult situation for the remaining cornerbacks. Keon Crossan has received first-team repetitions and has impressed during training camp, while Charles Woods is also competing for one of the available spots. Meanwhile, Marcel Debeau is trying to return from an ACL injury, but there are simply too many players competing for too few places. If the Patriots decide to keep 3 backup cornerbacks behind their starters, Dabo could become the odd man out, even though that would obviously be an unfortunate outcome given what he has been working through. And there is one more position battle that could quietly produce another difficult decision: tight end. Jake Westover had value last season because he could move around and contribute in different roles, but his transition back to the tight end position has not produced the kind of preseason performance needed to guarantee a roster spot. He has recorded only 1 reception on 3 targets for 13 yards, and his blocking has been described as merely adequate. For this Patriots offense, that is a major problem because the team is looking for a tight end who can provide dependable blocking, not simply another player who can catch a few passes. The biggest threat to Westover's roster position may be coming from a player who was barely part of the conversation before an injury changed everything. Tanner Arcand has taken advantage of his opportunity after Julian Hill was injured. He has received first-team offensive repetitions and has stood out as a blocker during both training camp and preseason action. That kind of development is exactly what can change a roster projection in the final days before cut down. The Patriots do not necessarily need to keep 4 tight ends, and if they decide to carry 3, Arcand's blocking ability could give him the advantage for the 3rd spot. So when you put everything together, the Patriots are not simply deciding which players are good enough. They are deciding which players fit the final 53-man roster best. A running back's special teams value, a linebacker's ability to avoid coverage and tackling mistakes, an offensive lineman's consistency, a cornerback's preseason performance, and a tight end's blocking ability can all become more important than what that player was projected to do when training camp began. And that is what makes this final stretch so fascinating. The Browns game on Thursday is not just another preseason game. For several players, it could be the final opportunity to change the coaching staff's opinion before the cuts begin. Some players may already have done enough, others may need one last performance to save their roster spot. And for a few of them, the next decision could determine whether they remain part of the Patriots' 53-man roster, move to the practice squad, or have to find their next opportunity somewhere else. With the deadline approaching and several roster battles still unresolved, which of these potential surprise cuts would be the biggest mistake for the Patriots? And which player do you believe has done the least to earn a spot on the final 53-man roster? That question becomes even more important when you look at what these final roster decisions really mean for the Patriots. The team is not going to have the luxury of keeping every player who has shown flashes during training camp or preseason. Once the roster has to be reduced from 90 players to 53, difficult decisions are unavoidable, and some of the players who have been around throughout the summer simply will not have a place on the final roster. The running back battle is a perfect example of how quickly things can change. A player can appear to have the advantage 1 week, only for another player to show more versatility and suddenly change the entire conversation. The competition for the 3rd running back spot is not necessarily going to be decided by who has the best rushing numbers alone. The Patriots have to consider what happens when that player is not carrying the football. Can he contribute on special teams? Can he catch passes? Can he give the offense another dimension? Those questions could ultimately determine who survives. That is why the final preseason game against Cleveland becomes so important. important, there may not be another opportunity after that game for the players on the bubble to make their case on the field. A strong performance could change the perception of a player who has struggled, while another disappointing performance could confirm what the coaching staff has already been seeing throughout the preseason. The same pressure exists at linebacker. The Patriots appear to have a small group of players who are already positioned well for roster spots, but the competition behind them remains unsettled. The problem for a player like Chad Muma is that mistakes are especially difficult to overcome when the team is evaluating whether you can be trusted during the regular season. A missed tackle or a bad coverage assignment in preseason does not automatically define a player, but repeated mistakes can become a pattern, and that pattern can influence the final decision. There is also an interesting contrast developing at the position. While one player has struggled to maintain the momentum he built during training camp, another young player has created a memorable moment by making a play when the Patriots needed it. That is exactly how roster battles can turn. Coaches need evidence that a player can execute under pressure, and a fourth down stop near the end zone can carry a different kind of weight than simply producing numbers in a low pressure situation. That does not necessarily mean the Patriots will make the younger player their answer at linebacker. The source material makes it clear that the position